All right, well, I'm going to throw one at you here from Study, with two Ds, Study, who says, I always take clean, no-bleed samples of the drum kit at the start of tracking. Why not use the samples to replace the bad bleed-covered tracks? For example, take 10 or more samples of clean tom hits and replace the close mics with the clean samples. What do you think about this approach?
Yes, I have absolutely done this, and there are arguments for and against that, and the arguments for that is that it's a more organic tone and related to the drum set, and not, not some sort of prepackaged, canned sort of tone. The arguments against that, or actually I'll just, word of caution, make sure that if you're doing that, you're taking samples, make sure the drummer gives you a really wide dynamic range of hits to choose from. Typically when a drummer is recording samples, they are playing harder than they are in the context of the song. So make sure you have a wide range of things to choose from if you need to replace those. And also not all dead center hits, some off center hits, because especially with toms, people tend to have a pretty wide wear pattern on the drum because they're not as accurate on toms as they tend to be on the snare. And I'll also take that even one step further and say that if you choose to take samples of the bass drum, make sure that those samples include both hits that are with the beater resting against the head after it's struck and with the beater bouncing off the head after it's struck. When you're resting the beater, you tend to have a much shorter decay than when you bounce the beater. So like instances of double bass playing or any sort of super fast bass drumming, they're not resting the beater on the head as they're going because they're constantly pulling it off. But in slower bass drumming, they tend to rest the beater on the head. So make sure you have both versions of those samples. If you choose to replace any bass drums that, when you're doing double bass stuff, you're pulling the resonant sounds. If you want it to feel realistic, and when you're doing single bass, you're doing the more dead type of sounds. The reason not to do that, aside from just the pain in the ass that is replacing drum hits, is especially toms, which tend to be very dynamic, and it's hard to really mimic those dynamics with samples. The other reason not to do it is there will actually be a phase relationship between the original tom track and your new tom track, since it's the same tone. So you really have to be very careful about lining up your transients exactly when doing it that way, so that the transient of the sample is in the exact same location as the transient of the original hit. If you don't do that, then your phase relationship between your sample and your overhead might wander from hit to hit. So you just have to be a little careful with that. And for that reason, I actually find that when and I don't do it often, but when I do bring samples into a setup, I'll use samples from some other session or from some sample pre-pack or something like that, because I know that those samples will have I don't want to say no phase relationship, but the phase relationship is much less important when using a sample from another recording session. That being said, it's great to have samples of your drum set as a safety, and I do it all the time because sometimes you might have a bad hit here or there. You might want to just replace one bad hit, or maybe there's like a riff with a bunch of bad hits. If common problem is a drummer who plays too high on their snare drum when they're playing a hi-hat beat. You might want to replace all the snares for just the hi-hat beat, but you might not want to have to replace the snare for the entire song. So then if you have samples, you can replace just in the area that you need without it affecting the rest of the track. And same thing with double bass, actually. One technique that some drummers use when recording double bass is if they know that they can't play a super fast double bass pattern as accurately as they want to, when that double bass pattern comes up, they'll just stop playing with their feet entirely and just do hands only. And then it'll be up to you as an engineer to create a kick track for that section. And if you have samples of the actual drum set, you can drop those in to only that section that requires it without having to lose the natural feel from the rest of the song. Yeah. Yeah, that's yeah, I guess that's about it for that
So when you're actually dropping the samples in, do you do that manually? Do you do it with like DRT and trigger like a lot of people do, or?
Well, if I'm dropping them in manually, then I use a bunch of things. Like, actually, we can just do a little example. When I was doing the tom editing, I'll just kind of drop into, well, you know what, I'll do it on a snare track. Let me grow this snare. What do I do? How do I use Pro Tools? Track height, large. Okay, so let's just say, for example, that I want to replace every snare hit with a tom, or that I'll just use a tom as an example. So let me make another track here, and then I'll assign the output of that track to my raw tracks, and look at that a little bigger. And I'm just going to kind of skip over these flams for now because you might handle those a little differently. But just there's a few backbeats here of snare. I'll just do the same thing that I did when I was editing toms, where I have my keyboard shortcuts turned on, tab to transient is turned on, and I'm just tabbing over to the beginning of the transient of each snare hit. Okay, then actually I'm going to put this track up above that. Okay, and then I'm just going to say, I've already edited these tom things, so I'm just going to pretend that this is a snare sample that I recorded after the session. I just copied this rack tom, pasted it up there, and let's actually make this a little bit bigger. It's actually going to be easier to edit to move around a larger segment. So I'm grabbing the rack track, and I'm going to hit Alt-Shift-3, which is a shortcut for consolidate region. So now I have this sample up here, which is, you know, a tom track, but let's pretend it's a snare, and I want to align it with this region. So I'm going to click on this region, and then Control click, and it will snap the beginning of my tom sample region to the same position as that. Okay, and then now I have one of two ways that I can also apply this to all the other regions. Let me actually make a few more regions. I'm kind of just going to pretend this snare is not a flam and not worry about how we handle that. So we have a few to deal with here. And I can now either, I think it's Control Option, click on this, and it will snap a copy of this region lined up with that. The other thing I can do is, I'm just going to remove that for now and sort of bring this back out to its original size. Okay, the other way that I can do this, if I have a lot of these to do that's a little faster, is, it's been a while since I've done this, so bear with me if I mess up. I'm going to grab that, I'm going to copy. So in Pro Tools I can just press C to copy, but I can also do it as an edit copy, or maybe it's Apple C. I think it's just C. Okay, so I'm going to copy, and then I'm going to turn off tab to transient. So now when tab to transient is turned off, as I tab, it will not follow the transients, but it will just tab to the beginning of the next region. Okay, so I'm going to tab to transient, and then I'm going to shift click my, my triggered track, and now when I tab over to the next one, it's tabbing over on both my original snare track and my triggered track. Then I can press V, and it will paste the copied snare trigger onto the new track. And now at this point, I can just keep doing tab V, tab V, tab V, tab V, all the way to the end of the song if I'm replacing every hit, or if it's just a section where I'm replacing every hit, I can just keep doing tab V, tab V, tab V. If you want to have any variance in the tones, like if you want to have like left hits and right hits, like you got to do that a little bit more manually. But if there's just like a segment where you want a bunch of identical hits, like in the case of a double bass section, you might want to do this. You know, double bass sections, more than likely you're, doing some kind of super perfect recording technique and you're on a grid and you can just say like, oh, eighth notes grid, and just make it all happen. But this is one way to, without any kind of triggering plug-in application, to just manually place a bunch of samples that goes relatively quickly.
Great.
I'm just going to delete this track so that it doesn't screw me up in the future.
That's probably smart. While you're doing that, do you plan to cover automation at all? We've got a question or two about that.
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of kinds of automation specific to drums.
Dude Bro. Good name.
Yeah, Dude Bro.
Was wondering whether you ever use volume automation to achieve a similar result for Tom Gating.
Oh yeah, I used to do it with. I didn't used to edit the toms. I used to do that all with volume automation. It's certainly a viable way to do it. You don't have the benefit of that rolling around crossover thing where the decay is a warmer tone than the attack when you do it with volume automation. The other reason not to do volume automation, aside from it being more time consuming, you don't have like the tab to transient automation so much, or the tab to transient option in writing volume automation quite as easily. But as you start to stack up things in Pro Tools and add things that consume system resources, the automation tabs actually become less accurate, and there can be a bit of a time lag in the volume automation. They may have fixed that in Pro Tools 11, but I know that I'm running 10, and I see subtle lags in time. So when I'm doing automation to guitars, for example, I have to sort of anticipate it sometimes. And when I am writing automation, I tend to treat it more like I'm doing a fader. So there's it's slower movements rather than just instantaneous up and downs. So I've had better luck doing it with editing, but if volume automation works for you, that's great. Just another thing about automation before I forget. I mentioned earlier about automating the SPL transient designer on drums once in a while. If you have a passage where it's too technical for the drummer to strike as hard as you want to hear it struck, I might turn transient designer on for that stuff. The other thing that I like to do is automate my overhead volume in relation to my room mic volume, depending on the tempo of the song. So slower songs might get a little bit more room mic, and faster songs might favor the overhead a little bit. And then also with regards to reverb time on the drums, or really the whole mix, faster songs might have a shorter reverb time, and slower songs might have longer reverb times.
Great, and I think we've got time for one more if the answer's quick. From Slow Eye. Do you experiment with the curves of the fades when doing the tom editing? Do you find that any particular curve seems to impart a more natural decay?
Yes, for sure, and that's something that is up to you in the song. But yeah, I tend to go with just whatever the default is. But an S curve can be nice, or all the different shapes, and the lengths of them can vary a lot. It's all sort of something you just got to determine on the fly. If you were listening to toms in solo, I think that would be a lot more important than if you had overheads and room mics and stuff factoring in. I think that the editing that I'm doing is actually, because a drum set is, there's a lot of inherent bleed within all the microphones of the drum set, that kind of makes that tom editing a lot more forgiving, and you can be tolerant of a super fast fade here or a super slow fade there if the circumstances dictate it.